The Art of Being Underestimated. An audiobook. There is a specific kind of power that only becomes available to a person once the room has already decided she is not dangerous. It cannot be manufactured by force, cannot be demanded, and cannot even be recognized by the person holding it until she notices what she can do, simply because no one is watching closely enough to stop her. History is unusually generous with women who understood this, and unusually stingy with crediting them for it. A servant nobody bothers to search. A wife assumed incapable of running an empire. A girl dismissed as too young to be taken seriously. Each of them discovered the same inversion. Contempt, properly understood, is not an injury. It is camouflage, freely issued by an opponent who has done the work of disarming himself. The masses spend enormous energy correcting other people's low opinion of them, proving competence, demanding recognition, insisting on being taken seriously before they've actually needed anyone to. This instinct feels like self-respect. It is frequently the single most expensive mistake available, because the moment your capability becomes visible, every advantage that invisibility was providing disappears at once. What follows is not a lesson in humility. It is the opposite, a study in how the most formidable women in the historical record built entire campaigns, empires, and careers inside the blind spot their era's contempt for them created, and how each of them chose, with total discipline, exactly when, if ever, to let that blind spot close. There is an old distinction worth drawing here between being small and being perceived as small. The two are rarely the same condition, and confusing them is the single most common error the masses make when they encounter their own underestimation. Being small is a fact about capability. Being perceived as small is a fact about someone else's incomplete information. And incomplete information in the hands of a patient strategist is simply an asset waiting to be spent. The 10 laws that follow rest on a single reversal worth sitting with before continuing. The room's low opinion of you is not a problem to be solved. It is, more often, a resource to be spent, carefully, on your own schedule, for exactly as long as it continues to serve you. Let's begin with the law that makes every other law in this record possible. The first law: let their assumptions do your work for you. Virginia Hall lost a leg in a hunting accident years before the Second World War began, and when she was recruited into Allied intelligence work in occupied France, that prosthetic limb, which she nicknamed Cuthbert, became, to her handler's quiet astonishment, one of her greatest operational assets. The Gestapo, hunting for the most effective Allied operative in the region, drew up a description, assuming a spy of her caliber would move like an athlete, blend seamlessly, show no physical marker at all. They searched for someone unremarkable in exactly the way their imagination expected competence to look. She did not fit that imagination, and so, for years, she simply wasn't found, coordinating resistance networks and organizing sabotage operations across France, while the most wanted woman posters in the region searched for someone who did not exist. This is the first and foundational law. An assumption, once formed in someone else's mind, requires no further effort from you to maintain. It maintains itself. The masses treat every misconception about them as an emergency requiring correction. Explaining, clarifying, proving the assumption wrong at the earliest opportunity, as though being accurately perceived were owed to every observer, regardless of what that accuracy would cost. The strategist asks a colder question first. What does this misconception currently allow me to do that accuracy would prevent? Translate this into an ordinary week. A colleague assumes, based on age or manner, or simply the softness of your voice in meetings, that you are not the person driving the room's actual decisions. Correcting that assumption loudly, in the moment, satisfies the ego and closes an option. Letting the assumption stand, while continuing to make the decisions regardless of who gets the public credit for them, keeps an entire category of scrutiny pointed at someone else. There will be a correct moment to reveal the truth of the matter, if one ever needs to arrive at all. It rarely needs to arrive as early as the ego would prefer. Nancy Wake, another Allied operative working in occupied France, was pursued by the Gestapo under the codename the White Mouse, credited with helping thousands of resistance fighters and becoming, for a time, the most wanted person on the Gestapo's list in the region. And yet she was consistently described by those who underestimated her as simply vivacious, social, a woman who enjoyed parties, a profile that fit almost none of what she was actually doing between them. The assumption cost her enemies dearly for years, because an assumption, once accepted, does not require its holder to keep testing it. It simply sits there, unexamined, doing its quiet work. There is a documented bias behind this. Once a person forms an initial impression, subsequent behavior tends to be interpreted in ways that confirm, rather than challenge it, a pattern researchers call confirmation bias. An observer who has already decided you are unremarkable will tend to explain away even fairly obvious evidence to the contrary, because revising the impression costs more cognitive effort than simply not noticing. This is not a flaw you need to fix in other people. It is a resource you are free to use. An assumption left uncorrected is a gift, but some circumstances require more than simply allowing a misconception to persist passively. They require actively constructing one, a full persona, built and maintained on purpose. The second law concerns what happens once you have decided to build that persona deliberately, rather than simply benefit from one that formed by accident. The second law: wear the costume completely or not at all. Deborah Sampson enlisted in the Continental Army disguised as a man, serving for over a year in combat, wounded twice, and treating one of her own wounds herself, rather than risk a field surgeon discovering her identity. The disguise was not a costume worn loosely at the edges, ready to slip at the first moment of pressure. It was total. Posture, manner, voice, the willingness to remove a musket ball from her own thigh with a penknife rather than expose herself to a doctor's examination. A partial disguise invites discovery precisely at the moment discovery is most costly. A complete one survives exactly that moment. The masses adopt a persona the way they adopt a New Year's resolution, enthusiastically at first, abandoned the moment it becomes inconvenient, or the moment no one seems to be watching closely enough to require the effort. This half measure is worse than no persona at all, because it advertises the existence of a performance without ever completing it, which is precisely what invites an audience to start looking for the seams. Whatever version of yourself you have constructed for a room that has not earned your full disclosure, composed where you are actually anxious, unbothered, where you are actually furious, competent, but modest, where you are actually the most capable person present. Commit to it entirely for as long as the room requires it. A performance abandoned halfway through is the only version of a performance that gets you caught. A British military doctor named James Barry lived and served an entire career as a man, rising to a senior rank in the Army Medical Service and performing one of the earliest recorded successful cesarean sections in the British Empire. And the truth of Barry's assigned sex at birth was only discovered after death, despite decades of close quarters, medical examinations of colleagues, and Army life that offered countless opportunities for discovery. The commitment to the persona was not occasional, it was constant in every recorded interaction for an entire lifetime, which is precisely why it survived that lifetime intact. In practice, this law rarely demands anything so dramatic. It might mean maintaining composure in a negotiation from the first handshake to the final signature, rather than relaxing the performance the moment the outcome feels secured, because rooms remember the moment the mask slipped far more vividly than they remember the hours it stayed in place. A costume, worn well, buys you access. It does not, on its own, buy you the years required to actually build something substantial behind it. The third law concerns what contempt is worth when it is allowed to run, uncorrected, across an entire career rather than a single operation. The third law: let contempt buy you the time you need. The woman history remembers as Empress Dowager Cixi entered the Chinese imperial court as a low-ranking concubine, a position considered so far beneath political relevance that decades of court records barely mention her at all. By the time she died, she had ruled China from behind a silk screen for nearly half a century, outlasting emperors, ministers, and an entire imperial bureaucracy that had spent that half-century consistently underestimating exactly how much power had accumulated behind that screen. She did not seize this position in a single dramatic stroke. She built it patiently, across decades, precisely because no one in that court's early history considered her worth watching closely enough to stop. Contempt, in her case, was not merely camouflage for a single operation. It was time itself, purchased at a discount, while everyone who might have opposed her progress assumed there was nothing yet worth opposing. The masses' experience being dismissed as a wound, requiring immediate repair. Proof they must work twice as hard, immediately, to earn a respect withheld too early. The strategist experiences the same dismissal as a gift of unmonitored time. Every year spent underestimated is a year spent building without an opponent bothering to interfere, because interference requires believing, first, that there is something worth interfering with. Blanche of Castile governed France twice as regent, first for her young son, and later during his absence on crusade, and was routinely described by contemporaries in terms that reduced her to a mother managing a household rather than a monarch managing a kingdom, a category that, again and again, failed to account for the decades of stable, competent governance she was actually providing. The underestimation was not merely tolerated, it was, in practical terms, useful, because a regent assumed to be temporary and incidental faces far less resistance than one openly identified as the actual center of power. The mechanism underneath this law is straightforward. Opposition requires resources, and resources are rarely spent opposing a target an opponent does not yet believe is worth the cost of opposing. Every day spent beneath that threshold of perceived threat is a day of unopposed construction. Time purchased through patience is only useful if something is actually being built inside it. The fourth law concerns exactly how much of what gets built should ever be shown to the room that failed to notice it happening in the first place. The fourth law: never show the full depth of what you know. Ada Lovelace was known to her era, when she was acknowledged at all, as the daughter of a famous poet and the translator of a foreign paper on an obscure calculating machine. Her actual contribution, a set of notes appended to that translation, containing what is now recognized as the first published algorithm intended to be processed by a machine, ran longer and cut deeper than the paper she was ostensibly only translating, and it went largely unrecognized as original work for the better part of a century. Charles Babbage, who built the machine her notes described operating, referred to her admiringly as the enchantress of numbers, a phrase that, however fond, still managed to describe her as an enchantment rather than an engineer. She did not need Babbage's era to recognize the full weight of what she understood. She simply did the work at the depth she was actually capable of, regardless of whether the credit or the comprehension arrived alongside it. This is the fourth law. Competence does not require an audience to be real, and a strategist who has learned to work at full capacity without insisting on immediate recognition retains an advantage that never depends on someone else's willingness to see her clearly. The masses reveal the entire scope of their competence at the first opportunity, eager for it to be acknowledged. The strategist reveals exactly as much as a situation requires, and keeps the remainder, often the majority, in reserve. Disclosed only when disclosing it produces an actual advantage, rather than simply satisfying an ego that wanted credit sooner than the moment called for it. Rosalind Franklin produced the X-ray diffraction images that provided the critical evidence for the double helix structure of DNA. Meticulous and exact work conducted with a rigor her own colleagues later acknowledged was essential to the discovery, credit for which was, in her lifetime, awarded almost entirely elsewhere. She continued the work at the standard she held herself to regardless of whether recognition arrived alongside it, and the quality of that work has, in the decades since, spoken for itself far more convincingly than any contemporaneous argument for credit could have. There is a real cost to this law, and it should not be minimized. Withheld competence sometimes means withheld credit, occasionally permanently. The strategist accepts this cost deliberately, weighing it against the alternative cost of showing a full hand before the room is ready to value it correctly. Withheld competence protects what you know. It says little about where you should be standing while you know it. The fifth law concerns the physical and organizational position most likely to reward someone nobody thinks to watch. The fifth law. The most overlooked position is the most valuable one. Mary Bowser was enslaved and later freed, and during the American Civil War, she took a position as a servant inside the Confederate White House, a role so far beneath the notice of the officials she served that they discussed sensitive military matters openly in rooms she was cleaning, never once suspecting that the woman refilling their glasses possessed a trained memory and a network waiting to receive exactly what she overheard. The information she passed along is credited with providing the Union with intelligence no other operative in the region could have obtained, precisely because no other operative had access to a room this thoroughly convinced its servant was invisible. The masses seek positions with visible prestige, assuming influence flows only through titles that announce themselves. The strategist studies which invisible positions, the assistant, the note-taker, the person handling logistics no one considers glamorous, sit closest to the actual flow of decisions, and recognizes that a role beneath anyone's suspicion is frequently the role with the clearest access to everything worth knowing. Being handed the unglamorous task is not, in every case, a demotion. It is occasionally the exact position from which the entire board becomes visible, precisely because no one thought to hide the board from someone they'd already decided didn't matter. Sarah Aronson helped run an intelligence network gathering information on Ottoman military movements in Palestine during the First World War, operating for years under cover of her family's respected work in regional agriculture, a profession considered so far removed from military affairs that it drew almost no suspicion, even as it provided a legitimate reason for frequent travel, correspondence, and contact across a wide territory. The unglamorous cover was the entire infrastructure. Consider the ordinary version of this in a modern workplace. The person taking meeting notes is frequently the person with the clearest written record of every commitment made in that room, and the person handling scheduling is frequently the one who can see, before anyone else, exactly where every important relationship in the organization is heading next. Elizabeth Van Lew ran one of the most effective Union spy networks operating inside the Confederate capital during the Civil War, and did so partly by cultivating a public reputation as an eccentric, harmless spinster, a persona so effective that Richmond society nicknamed her Crazy Bet, and largely stopped paying attention to her comings and goings as a result. The eccentricity was not incidental to the network. It was the network's outer wall, built deliberately so that a woman moving intelligence through the city could do so under a reputation nobody thought worth investigating. An overlooked position grants access. Access alone accomplishes nothing without the willingness, eventually, to act on what it reveals, and to act at exactly the right moment rather than the first available one. The sixth law concerns timing the reveal itself. The sixth law. Reveal your full capability. Only at the decisive moment. Inscriptions from the Shang dynasty, carved into oracle bones more than 3,000 years ago, record a woman named Fu Hao, a royal consort, who also commanded military campaigns involving thousands of troops, some of the largest documented in her era, and who is credited with victories that expanded the dynasty's territory substantially. For much of the historical memory that survived her, she was recorded primarily as a consort and a priestess, categories that, on their own, would never have hinted at the scale of the military authority she also held and exercised when the moment required it. She did not spend her years as consort loudly announcing a military ambition that had not yet been called for. The capability existed, cultivated and ready, and was deployed at full scale only once the situation actually demanded a general rather than a courtier. This is the sixth law. Readiness and display are not the same activity, and a strategist can spend years appearing to occupy one role while maintaining, privately, the full capacity to occupy an entirely different one the instant circumstances require it. The masses feel pressure to demonstrate every capability continuously, as proof that the capability exists at all. The strategist understands that a capability demonstrated only when it is needed retains far more force than one worn daily as a badge, because the sudden, decisive reveal recalibrates everyone in the room at once, in a way that a capability everyone had already grown used to seeing simply cannot. Tomo Gozen, a woman warrior serving in 12th century Japan, is recorded in period accounts as having accompanied a military commander in what could easily have been read, at a glance, as a purely companionable or ceremonial role, until the battles she is described fighting in reveal a warrior of considerable skill, credited with taking the heads of enemy commanders in combat accounts that treat her competence as simply a fact of the record, rather than something requiring justification. The role she occupied day to day gave no advance warning of the role she occupied in the moments that actually mattered. A decisive reveal depends on having built genuine capability beforehand, unseen. Some of the deepest camouflage available for that kind of building comes not from any deliberate disguise at all, but from qualities a strategist did nothing to construct: youth, softness, the simple fact of being underestimated by default rather than by design. The seventh law. Let youth and softness be misread as weakness. Kutulun, a Mongol princess and niece of Kublai Khan, was renowned across the steppe for wrestling, and for a standing wager, she offered any suitor who wished to marry her. Defeat her in a wrestling match, and she would marry him. Lose, and he forfeited horses to her instead. Contemporary accounts describe her as undefeated across the entirety of her competing life, having wagered and won an enormous herd of horses from suitors who arrived, again and again, having assumed a princess's challenge could not possibly be a serious athletic threat. Each suitor's assumption was the same one that had failed the suitor before him, and each one seems to have made it anyway, because the assumption was never really about her specific reputation. It was about a much older, much lazier assumption regarding what femininity implies about physical capability in general. She never needed to correct the assumption in advance. She simply let each challenger arrive with his confidence fully intact and let the match itself do the correcting. The masses, dismissed for youth or softness or manner, feel compelled to announce their capability loudly in advance, eager to prevent the underestimation from occurring at all. The strategist recognizes that an opponent who arrives overconfident has already made half her argument for her, and that the correction landing inside the actual contest carries far more weight than any correction offered as a warning beforehand ever could. Lozen, an Apache warrior and strategist, was described by her own people as possessing skill in battle equal to any man in her band, and yet the historical record surrounding her makes clear that outsiders, settlers, soldiers, rival negotiators routinely failed to account for her role in planning and executing campaigns that outmaneuvered forces with vastly superior numbers and equipment. The dismissal was never corrected in advance. It simply failed to survive contact with the campaigns themselves. Petra Herrera fought in the Mexican Revolution, disguised for a period as a man, before eventually leading her own regiment of soldaderas openly as a woman, credited by some accounts with commanding forces in the taking of Torreon, a role that had to be actively fought for against commanders who assumed a woman could organize supply lines but not lead troops into combat. The dismissal cost her recognition that arguably should have followed the victories themselves. It never once cost her the victories. Youth and softness are underestimations handed to you before you've done anything at all. The eighth law concerns an underestimation you construct on purpose, from nothing, by cultivating a presence so unremarkable that no one thinks to examine it more closely. The eighth law: become so unremarkable that no one thinks to watch you. Rose Vallon worked as an unpaid, unremarkable-seeming clerk at a Paris museum used by occupying German forces to catalog and store art looted from Jewish families and collections across France. She was assumed by the officers working around her to understand no German, to notice nothing of consequence, to be exactly the sort of quiet institutional fixture that a serious intelligence operation would never think to monitor. She understood German perfectly. For 4 years, she secretly recorded the details of works being cataloged and their intended destinations, information that, after the war, became instrumental in recovering thousands of pieces of stolen art that would otherwise have vanished permanently into private hands. She built nothing about her position to suggest significance. This was the entire strategy. A person who has cultivated even a modest reputation for being interesting invites observation, and observation is the one thing an operation like hers could never survive. The eighth law asks something the ego resists more than almost any other: the deliberate cultivation of being forgettable in exactly the rooms where being remembered would be fatal to what you're actually accomplishing. The masses want to be noticed in every room, assuming visibility is universally an asset. The strategist knows precisely which rooms reward visibility and which ones only reward disappearing into the wallpaper thoroughly enough that the most sensitive information in the building continues to be discussed as though she weren't standing in it. Martha Knockert worked as a nurse treating German soldiers during the First World War while secretly passing intelligence to Allied forces. Her presence in military hospitals, considered so routine, so entirely expected, that almost no one paused to consider what a nurse quietly moving between wards might be overhearing, retaining, and passing along. The uniform of an ordinary, expected role is frequently the most effective disguise available, precisely because no one budgets suspicion for a role they already expect to see. Every law so far has treated being underestimated as a source of time, access, and cover. The ninth law goes further, revealing a use for contempt that only becomes visible under real pressure, the moment an opponent finally tries to break you. The ninth law: let their contempt be the thing that protects you. Noor Inayat Khan, a British Special Operations executive radio operator working undercover in occupied Paris, was assessed by some of her own superiors before deployment as too gentle, too dreamy, unsuited to the brutal demands of clandestine work, an assessment that nearly kept her from being sent at all. She was deployed anyway, was eventually captured by the Gestapo, and under prolonged interrogation and imprisonment, gave her captors nothing: no names, no networks, no information. Despite conditions that broke operatives her superiors had rated as considerably tougher on paper. The very gentleness that had been mistaken for unsuitability appears, by every surviving account, to have concealed a depth of resolve her interrogators never correctly priced into their strategy, because they had inherited the same lazy assumption her own superiors initially held, that softness and capacity for endurance were opposites, rather than, in her case, simply two qualities occupying the same person without contradiction. The masses assume that being underestimated is purely a tactical convenience, useful for gathering information undisturbed. The ninth law reveals its deeper function. Contempt from an opponent frequently causes that opponent to underinvest in defenses against you specifically, assuming the threat you pose has already been fully measured and found small. An adversary convinced you are not dangerous rarely prepares adequately for the version of you that actually shows up. There is a broader principle in threat assessment worth naming directly. Resources allocated to defense are almost always allocated in proportion to perceived risk, not actual risk, and the gap between the two is where every underestimated operative in this record found her working room. An opponent who has already concluded you pose a small threat commits a small defense, and a small defense, tested by an actual full-scale threat, tends to fail in exactly the places it was never reinforced. Odette Sansom, another Special Operations executive agent, was captured, interrogated, and eventually sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where she endured conditions that killed many operatives with reputations for considerably greater physical toughness than the gentle, almost ordinary impression she was said to have made on colleagues before deployment. She disclosed nothing that compromised her network throughout the entire ordeal. Whatever her captors expected to break, based on the impression she gave them, was simply not the thing that was actually holding her together. 9 laws show how to use being underestimated while it lasts. The final law concerns the single hardest discipline in this entire record: what to do in the moment you have finally, undeniably, been proven right. The 10th law: never fully collect on the debt of being proven right. Elizabeth Smith Friedman was hired in the early 20th century in roles her own era frequently filed under secretarial or literary, a poetry scholar recruited, almost by accident, into cryptographic work, and went on to break codes that dismantled Prohibition-era smuggling networks and, later, Nazi spy rings operating in South America, work whose full extent remained classified and uncredited for decades after her death, often attributed instead to male colleagues or to agencies eager to keep her methods and her role quiet. She built and executed some of the most significant code-breaking work of her era, largely without the public credit that would have been the ordinary reward for it, and she appears, by the available record, to have continued the work regardless of who received the applause for it. This is the 10th and final law, and the hardest one to practice, because every instinct built across the previous 9 laws will eventually demand its moment of vindication. Once you have been proven right, having once been so thoroughly underestimated, the temptation is to collect on that vindication publicly, permanently, and as loudly as possible. The strategist resists the full collection. She takes the private satisfaction of having been right. She does not always insist on the public correction, because a woman who has just demonstrated how dangerous she is when underestimated has, in that very demonstration, taught every future opponent not to underestimate her again. And the single greatest asset built across all 9 laws before this one was precisely that ongoing, renewable contempt. Spend it all at once, and it never regenerates. Spend it selectively, and it remains available for the rest of a career. This is the hardest law in the record to practice, because it asks a woman to hold the very proof of her own vindication in reserve, unspent, even when every part of her wants to present it in full. But a debt collected in full closes the account permanently. The opponent recalibrates completely, prepares accordingly, and the advantage is gone for good. A debt collected only partially, deliberately, leaves the account open, and an account left open is an account that continues paying out for as long as the underestimation is allowed to persist. Katherine Johnson calculated the trajectories that sent early American space flights safely into orbit and back, at a NASA where she was doubly dismissed, first as a woman, and separately by the segregation of her era, excluded for years from meetings where her own calculations were being discussed. She continued producing work precise enough that astronauts reportedly requested her calculations be checked by hand before trusting the newly installed computers. The recognition arrived slowly, decades later, in books and films rather than in the paychecks or the titles of her working years. And by every account, she simply kept doing the work at full rigor throughout, letting the calculations themselves make an argument she was never given the platform to make directly. 10 laws, each one turning a single ordinary discomfort, being dismissed, doubted, overlooked, into a resource most people spend their whole lives fighting to correct instead of learning to use. Closing. The final value of being seen wrong. None of the women in this record enjoyed being dismissed. Contempt is not pleasant to receive, regardless of how strategically it can be converted afterward. What each of them discovered, across very different centuries and very different battles, was that the discomfort of being underestimated could be metabolized into something considerably more valuable than the respect they were denied: time, access, cover, and the sustained advantage of an opponent who never adequately prepared for what was actually standing in front of him. The masses will always experience being underestimated as an insult requiring correction. Now you have 10 laws worth of evidence that it can be something else entirely, the most reliable weapon available to anyone patient enough to let it work uninterrupted. Let them underestimate you, then let the record speak for itself, on your schedule, not theirs. The women in this record were never given permission to be as capable as they were. Permission was never the mechanism that mattered. What mattered, in every single case, was the decision to keep building, regardless of whether permission ever arrived, and the discipline, once the results finally spoke, to let those results do the talking, rather than a lifetime of grievance about how long the room took to notice. That is the entire art, not becoming underestimated, learning what to do with it once you already are. Before this record closes, consider the 10 laws once more, stripped down to their working parts. Let assumptions do your work. Stop correcting misconceptions that are currently protecting you. Wear the costume completely. A half-maintained persona is more dangerous than none at all. Let contempt buy you time. Every year underestimated is a year building unopposed. Withhold the full depth of what you know. Competence does not require an audience to be real. Seek the overlooked position. The unglamorous seat is often the one closest to everything worth knowing. Reveal capability only at the decisive moment. Readiness and display are not the same activity. Let youth and softness be misread. An overconfident opponent has already made half your argument for you. Become unremarkable where visibility would be fatal. Not every room rewards being noticed. Let their contempt protect you under real pressure. An opponent who has already dismissed you rarely prepares adequately for who you actually are. And finally, never fully collect the debt of being proven right. Spend it selectively, and it remains available for the rest of a career. None of these require permission to begin. They require only the willingness to let a room be wrong about you for exactly as long as that wrongness serves you, and not one day longer than it does.